Hello and welcome. If you're lucky enough to own a Bernina 700 series or 800 series sewing machine, you may want to check the motor, and specifically the motor brushes and the capacitor set. So you may want to check the motor brushes and the capacitors really only if maybe you haven't used your machine in a very long time, it's been in storage, or it hasn't been serviced for a long time, or you've come across one of these in the wild and you've just brought it home, but you don't know the history of it. I would definitely, the first thing I would do, especially if the machine is in unknown condition, before plugging the machine in at all, I would definitely be checking the motor brushes, because if the motor brushes are worn out or getting close to wearing out, you don't really want to be using the machine at all, because if those motor brushes wear out, it could damage the machine to the point where it could be quite an expensive repair. The capacitors aren't such a big problem, but you don't really want to be plugging the machine in either. If the capacitors are blown, or if they're on the way to failing, that's not such a huge deal, because although the capacitors can, they can make a loud bang when they fail, they pump out a lot of smoke, give you a fright, the capacitors aren't absolutely necessary. So although they may fail, they can be removed at a pinch. I wouldn't suggest running the machine without them. The other symptom of the capacitors failing could be that the machine will run on, which means that even though you're not pushing your foot down on the foot controller, the machine will run just by plugging in the power and turning the power on. So, and the only way to stop the machine is disconnect the machine from the power. That's a classic symptom of capacitors failing. So the best thing to do is to check that before you do anything. So I'll show you how to get access to the motor, how to remove the motor, and to check the brushes and the capacitors. Yeah, sorry about the state of this 830, it needs a little bit of a tidy up. So the motor is around the back here and lives in this area here, inside this plastic covering. You can see here that the plastic covering's discoloured. That's a bit of yellowing from just sitting in the sun, and that's just the bromide in the plastic that's discolouring there. The bromide's a flame retardant that they put into the plastics. Yep, power socket down here. Now I can't stress enough how important it is to remove the power. As long as you've got the power plug unplugged from here at all times, during this process, you'll be safe. Obviously you'll want to plug in the power when you're testing the machine, but at any other time, make sure you've got this power socket unplugged. You don't want to be getting into here with the power plugged in, because there's live wires in behind here, so just make double sure of that. Make sure that if you ever do plug it in and you need to get in to the motor section here, just double check, make sure you've unplugged the power cable there. So first of all, I'll show you how to remove the end panel here. We need to get this end panel off for a start, and this particular one is the 830. I'll also show the 810B panel removal, but this one you'll notice has no screws on the side here, so the mounting screw for this one actually comes in from underneath. We'll tip the machine up so that we can see the base of it. Quite often there's a cover. Yeah, there's a cover that sits in here as well, and you can see that this one's actually broken quite badly. This machine just needs a little bit of TLC, maybe a new cover on the bottom there. But remove this screw here. You can see that's actually broken through, so this cover comes off after taking that screw out, and then just get a flathead screwdriver, undo this screw here, and this being the 830, that's really all you need to do to get this cover off. So just pull out at the bottom and you'll see that pops off there. And you might have heard that little nut here. Just make sure, because sometimes these crack completely away. You can see that one's slightly cracked there. There's a little nut that sits inside there, and that's what the screw screws into up through the base there. So what you can do to sort of keep this all intact is just screw the screw back in to the nut there, and that stops it from falling out and just keeps everything safe. And there you'll see we've got on the 830, and the 810B is very similar. We've got the motor belt and the main belt heading up to the top shaft there. So I'll show you the same process for the 810B. So it's just a matter of removing the side panel here, just 3 screws. You know, if you don't feel comfortable getting in here, I would just leave it to your mechanic to check this out. Just tip the machine over like that. Those screws can be quite tight, and it can pay to have a pen and paper handy just for drawing a little diagram, just in case the capacitor cables come off and you're not sure exactly where they go back on. You can do this without disconnecting the capacitor if you're careful. So they're the 2 motor mount screws, and now we can remove, well, not fully remove, but we can at least tip the motor back and get access. And there are 2 posi drive screws here, so we use a posi drive screwdriver. At a pinch, a Phillips screwdriver will do, but the Phillips screwdriver will slightly damage the posi drive screws. So I mean, if you can, try and get a posi drive screwdriver. Okay, so we take off these 2 screws here. Make sure you've got your power cord disconnected. This live wire's in behind here. That back panel here comes off, and here we have the motor in here. Now, some models have little ports in the top. You can take the screw out via the port in the top and the bottom. You can check on the 830 or any machine that's got these ports available, top and bottom. Here's the other one for the bottom. These give you access to the motor brushes, and that can be done with the motor in situ, so you don't actually have to take the motor off to do this. So you've got access to the top motor brush there, just through that little access port there. Obviously, you know, there's the little cap that goes back on there, and if you have a look under the machine, you'll see the other access port there. So you don't actually need to take the motor off to check the motor brushes for these types of machines that have the access ports here. But this particular model doesn't have the little ports, so we have to actually take the motor out. Now you don't have to remove any wiring if you're careful. Now the capacitor is down in here. It's a set of capacitors. There's 2 X-class capacitors and 2 Y-class capacitors. So the X-class go across the phase and neutral, one across the bulb and one across the foot controller. Yeah, there's your 2, there's a little diagram here, 2 X-class capacitors at the top here, and 2 Y-class capacitors going to the motor ground. Now what you're looking for here is you're looking for splits. Normally they split long ways down here, and they'll leak a little bit of fluid. If you see that, the capacitor's on the way out. Now the capacitors are designed to fail safely. When they do fail, they go with quite a bang and a puff of smoke, and they really stink. If you ever have that happen, just first thing to do is turn the power off at the mains and remove the power cable from the back of the machine. and then get it to your service person. If you want to carry on sewing and you're in a bit of a bind, you can remove this capacitor set altogether. Now, I don't recommend running the machine like that. It causes interference and can cause arcing in the foot controller and a little bit of flickering on the bulb. So what you're looking for is leakage, really, and these can blow up at any time. I mean, that looks fine. I don't think this is going to blow in the near future, but at some stage that will blow, and it's difficult to say when. It could be next week, it could be tomorrow, it could be in 3 years' time. It's just difficult to say. But if it's leaking, or it's got a split in it, or it's bulging, well, there's an imminent problem. It's going to blow fairly soon. Yeah, as I say, disconnect it. You can pull the cables straight off the terminals. There's 4 cables. There's a white, a brown, a black, and a clear or transparent. Those colours may vary depending on your region, but you can literally just disconnect that. These can be rebuilt. The capacitors are a really common off-the-shelf item. So what you want to do with your piece of paper is, or take a photograph, is you want to, just in case while you're doing this, if any of these connections come off these terminals, you want to know where they go back on again. So if we take a close look at these 2 cables here, this lower cable here with these 2 strands here, you've got your blue and your black, they're your bulb, and then this upper cable here, those 2, they go to different terminals, so you want to take note of that. And it's a good idea to take note of this before you start really getting into here. I'm playing around too much, because just in case they unplug, you've got that reference. And that's the switch. Yeah, that's the speed switch. So black to this terminal and blue to the next terminal. And your capacitor, white, is on this very right hand terminal. You've got a gap there, and then you've got capacitor black, then capacitor brown, and the transparent of the capacitor goes to the ground of the motor. Don't specifically use this as a reference, because, as I say, your colours may vary on different regions. I'm not sure about that, but here in New Zealand, these machines, though, that they will be manufactured for the New Zealand market, I guess, or for maybe the Australasian market, and they will be complying at the time with the electrical code for the colour coding. So yeah, just make sure you make your own notes when you do deal with this. But what you can do, you can carefully get the motor, and the motor just pulls straight towards you like that, and if you just get it out far enough, I'll pull this capacitor out, might make it a little bit easier to get out, and I would just pull it out far enough to allow you to get your screwdriver, flat screwdriver, and undo this here. That's the cap that holds the motor brush in. And you want to be careful when you're doing this, just loosen that. They're not overly tight, they don't need to be overly tight. They're on a spring, so just be careful that they don't pang out, and you want to try and keep their orientation consistent. So when you pull this brush out, you want to make sure it goes back in the same way if you can. So just grip the spring and just gently pull that out, and you can see that there's a bit of life left in that brush there. Now, how much life is left in that, it's difficult to say, but it comes down to how often you use the machine. You definitely don't want this carbon brush here to wear right down without you even sort of knowing about it, and then the metal spring, so it wears away this carbon brush, and then the metal spring makes contact with the motor commutator, and that basically it doesn't destroy the motor, but it certainly causes major issues, and the motor will need a rebuild if that happens, and that's not a cheap exercise, especially here where the small motor repair people are getting few and far between. So when you put that back in, just make sure it goes back in the same way. The motor brush is rectangular, so there's only two ways that will go in. But if you get it 180 degrees out, the brushes will just be a little bit noisy for a little bit until they wear back in to the commutator, because the motor brush housing there is just slightly off center to the commutator, or they can be slightly off center. So they wear slightly off center, so that's why it's a good idea to make sure they go back in the way they came out. And then you just screw that up and just give it a very slight nip up with your screwdriver. Yeah, that doesn't need to be overly tight, that screw there. And then you do the same with the other motor brush. And as you can see, that brush is a similar size. I've never really seen brushes wear unevenly, so if you check one, I guess you could assume that the other is around about the same length, but that would be an assumption. But yeah, as I say, I've never seen them wear unevenly. So we'll just screw that one back in. You might find that these rubber mounts may come off when you've got the motor out, but just, sit them back over the motor there, like so, and just slip the motor back into its housing there, like so. Just make sure that you don't catch this is the ground strap. That's the ground strap there for the motor. That's the capacitor lead there for the ground. So just when you're sliding that back in, just make sure it's not going to catch on anything. Slide that in there, and then just slip the capacitor back down in its little cubby there. That's all set to put back together. None of the cables have come loose. Make sure before you put this back together that all your leads are still on the terminal securely there, which they are in this instance. So we haven't actually disconnected anything at all there, which is quite handy. And then these two cables here, they come out through this slot here in the plastic housing. Yeah, when you're getting these two cables sorted, try not to pinch them in between this plastic cover and the motor housing. The other thing I see with these machines is the motor housings can sometimes be a bit cracked around, the mounts and where these screws screw in here. That can be fixed up just with some fairly strong sort of glue to get a bit more life out of it. So then we just go ahead and screw that back in there. That doesn't need to be overly tight. I think that's what can crack these sometimes, if these screws here are over tightened. This one's looking in pretty good nick. There's actually no cracking whatsoever on there. Okay. And you might also notice down on the bed here there's actually like a rubber mat, sort of a plasticky rubbery type mat that can just be pulled off and cleaned. Well, I've placed the motor back on. I'll get the mounting screws in there. Now, I haven't done these up tight yet. I won't do those up tight just yet, because I want to put the motor belt on first. But you may have noticed the thread caught around the motor belt there, so I'll just get in there and remove that thread there. There we go. We can just put the motor belt on the small pulley, run it over the top of the large pulley there, and turn the machine. And yeah, I think that belt's probably a little bit loose, but So I won't go and adjust that just yet. I'm sure that'll be tight enough to run the machine. And so we'll just do these motor mount screws up there. If it wasn't for the fact that that capacitor could be in a sad state, I would probably plug the machine in first. It'd probably be the first thing I would do to make sure it actually runs. But because I see quite a few of those capacitors starting to blow at this age, I'm a bit reluctant to do that without checking them. So now is probably a good time to just plug the power in. Just check your power cord too. Just check it for any insulation that might be sort of failing. And definitely don't plug it in if you see bare wires. So if you're not sure of the history of the machine, and I would definitely check those sorts of things. Make sure that the insulation's not pulling back on the plug here. And again, the worst thing you want to see really is bare copper wires. So it pays to do a visual inspection right along the cable. Run your fingers along. If you feel little cuts or nicks or anything like that, have a really good look. Bend it back where you see the cut, and if you could see copper wire in there, or even through the first layer of insulation, just be really careful. If you see copper wire there, that's dangerous. I wouldn't use the machine in that state. Get it to a repair person. And check that. Sorry about the grubbiness of this this machine. I haven't cleaned it at all. Check this area here for insulation issues. So the insulation is just really the plastic coating that insulates between you and the copper wires, and between the copper wires themselves. So that's all looking good. Plug that in there. Plug in the foot controller there. So the machine's plugged in. I'll remove the presser foot. Light switch here on the side. Light's not working. Yep. Now if we take a look back at the 830 here, just to demonstrate this, you can actually test the motor separately of the machine. So here's the motor detached from the machine. Now again, I must stress, make sure you have the plastic cover on here, because there's live wires in behind here. You definitely don't want to be testing this motor without this cover on. So make sure you've got this cover on before you plug this plug in here. We can plug the plug in there, and I've got the foot controller on the floor there. I'll just put my foot down, turn the power on. I'll just slowly put my foot down here, and you can hear that going. Now because this motor's not under load, there's no belts attached, it's not driving the machine or anything, you don't really want to run this motor for too long when it's not under load. Or you definitely don't want to sort of put your foot to the floor and spin it up to a huge amount of revs. You don't really want to sort of spin it up so that it goes flat out for very long at all. I mean, it's probably okay to do very quickly. You can hear that it's going very fast, a lot faster than what it's designed to, because there's no load here. So a very short burst like that's probably okay, but in a little slowly like that. So just slowly is probably okay for a test. So I'll go ahead and put this motor back onto the 830. that's looking fine there. I've got another motor here that I can test. That looks like it's also from an 830. It's got the little inspection port there for the motor brushes. Not sure of the status of this here, but yeah, it's probably a good idea to check the motor brushes and the state of the capacitor, just as a matter of course, really. So I hope you found that video helpful, and thank you very much for watching.